Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Lowy Institute for our Distinguished Speakers Series lecture for today. The number of refugees in the world is on the rise. From 2.4 million in 1975, it grew to 18.2 million in 1993. A temporary decline in the early 2000s has been reversed, and the UNHCR estimated that at the end of 2010, there were 43.7 million refugees in the world, showing a 17% increase in the number of asylum applications made to developed countries. Refugees are certainly part of Australia's story. As a land of immigration, we have been enriched by waves of refugees fleeing horror in other countries. Perhaps Australia's most famous refugee is Frank Lowy, the founder of this institute. And yet refugees and asylum seekers have become more controversial in recent years. Currently, there is no issue in Australian politics more explosive or more divisive as the issue of asylum seekers. Lowy Institute polling has registered high levels of public concern about the issue. Last year saw 72% of those polled either very or somewhat concerned about boat-borne asylum seekers. And yet on the other side, Australia stands only second to Spain in terms of per capita private contributions to Friends of the UNHCR. At this very podium, the Prime Minister delivered a policy speech on the issue of asylum seekers in 2010, announcing an intention to establish a processing centre in East Timor. Last year, again at this podium, the opposition leader outlined the coalition's policy on the issue. Meanwhile, Lowy Institute visiting fellow Khalid Koza has provided regular policy analysis and recommendations on the issue of refugees and asylum seekers. So given the Lowy Institute's history of work on this issue and attention to this issue, it is a real pleasure to welcome to this podium the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Mr. Antonio Guterres. Mr. Guterres became the 10th UN High Commissioner for Refugees on June the 15th, 2005, and was elected to a second 5-year term by the UN General Assembly, concluding June 14, 2015. He heads one of the world's foremost humanitarian organisations. The UNHCR has twice won the Nobel Peace Prize. Its more than 7,000 staff members work in 126 countries, providing protection and assistance to millions of refugees, returnees, and internally displaced people and stateless persons. Before joining UNHCR, Mr. Guterres spent more than 20 years in government and public service. He served as Portuguese Prime Minister from 1995 to 2002, during which time he was heavily involved in the international effort to resolve the crisis in East Timor. As President of the European Council in early 2000, he led the adoption of the so-called Lisbon Agenda and co-chaired the first EU-Africa Summit. He also founded the Portuguese Refugee Council in 1991 and was part of the Council of State of Portugal from 1991 to 2002. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Antonio Guterres.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a great pleasure and a privilege for me to be with you today. Less than 2 months ago, UNHCR concluded a year-long campaign to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the 51 Convention and the 50th anniversary of the 61 Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness. And inevitably, these anniversaries have led us to reflect on the state of the 43.7, I confirm the figure, million people worldwide, about twice the population of Australia, who have been forcibly displaced from their homes by conflict and persecution. Some of them crossing borders, becoming refugees, others remaining within the borders of their own countries, becoming internally displaced people. To meet their protection needs in the next decade will require a sound understanding of the changing dynamics of displacement and the responses available to the international community. UNHCR was created 61 years ago to lead and coordinate international action to protect refugees and resolve refugee problems worldwide. Today, only about 1/3 of our people of concern, 10.5 million, are refugees, crossed borders. More than twice as many others are displaced within their own countries by conflict and violence, and they are not protected by international law. They are under the authority of their own government, and sometimes their own government is part of the problem, not part of the solution. Also, some 3.5 million persons under our mandate are stateless, although estimates go as high as 12 million people worldwide in this situation. But none of these figures, as daunting as they may be, can convey the full scale and complexity of forced displacement today. In an increasingly unbalanced world, violence and persecution are multiplying, as the large displacement crises of 2011 have shown in Côte d'Ivoire, North Africa and the Middle East, Somalia and Sudan. Nearly 800,000 people became refugees crossing borders last year as a result of these events. While many Ivorian and Libyan refugees have since gone back, return remains a distant hope for those who were uprooted from their communities in Somalia and in the Blue Nile and South Kordofan states of Sudan. Nearly a quarter of Somalia's population is now displaced, and more than 5 million people are affected by displacement in and around Sudan and South Sudan. But as new crises multiply, old ones seem to never die. Conflicts are becoming more intractable, and sustainable political solutions are rare, leaving millions of refugees unable to return home to places like Afghanistan, Iraq, or the Eastern DRC. Durable solutions have become difficult to attain, and more than 2/3 of the refugees under UNHCR's mandate now live in protracted situations of exile, having left their country of origin more than 5 years ago. Voluntary repatriation opportunities are scarce, with the number of annual returns in the last 2 years having dropped by 80% from the average of 1 million returnees per year over the past 2 decades. And similarly, the global total of available resettlement spaces, some 80,000 every year, covers only 1 in every 10 refugees in need of this solution. I remember when I started my political activities, we lived in a bipolar world with 2 megapowers, the US and the Soviet Union. It was a complex system, but it had some rules. And obviously, the capacity of independent actors to create problems was submitted to the authority of these 2 states. Then, and the crisis of East Timor was a good example of how things could work at that time, we lived in a unipolar world with a clear hegemonic situation of the United States of America. But now we no longer live in the unipolar world, but we are not yet also in a multipolar world. We live in a situation where power relations are not clear. We never had a true global governance system in the world, but we had clear power relations. And the power relations define, to a certain extent, the governance mechanisms of our planet. Now, we don't have a global governance mechanism, and we don't have a clear system of power relations. And that is creating a lot of unpredictability in international relations that has made the prevention of conflicts more difficult and the solution of conflicts even more difficult. And so we are witnessing today a multiplication of crises and the difficulty to solve the old crisis, generating a larger and larger number of refugees. And I don't think this will, I would say, improve, because eventually it will even be worse in the near future. And in addition to forced displacement affecting more people and for longer periods of time than only a decade ago, it is also growing in complexity. Conflict and upheaval, the traditional drivers of displacement, are increasingly compounded, if not exacerbated, by a number of interrelated and mutually reinforcing global trends. These include population growth, urbanization, food and water scarcity, and most dramatically, the effects of climate change. Climate change touches on almost all spheres of life on Earth. And this is also true for displacement, where it has a multiplying effect on all other factors that drive people from their homes. There is increasing evidence confirming the close link between climate change and the growing frequency and intensity of some natural disasters. And such disasters are already proving their capacity to displace as many people as the conflict-related movements UNHCR has more traditionally been engaged with. But although they attract less media attention, the slow onset effects of climate change, like drought, desertification, rising sea levels, and shrinking agricultural productivity, will likely also contribute to millions being forced to abandon their homes in the future. But while humanitarian action is more and more needed, it faces a clear shrinking of the humanitarian space. And there are three dimensions of these: the changing nature of conflict, the tougher line taken by some states on national sovereignty at the detriment of the protection of human rights, and the blurring of traditional distinctions between civilian and military spheres in the action of the international community. Today's conflicts are fought by a multiplicity of actors, many of whom have no respect for the humanitarian principles of humanity, impartiality, and neutrality, or indeed for the safety of humanitarian staff. In theaters of conflict today, one may find national and possibly international armies, ethnic or religious-based militias, insurgent groups, and more simple bandits. And all of these actors have been responsible for serious human rights violations. Providing humanitarian relief in such an unpredictable environment is both difficult and dangerous, and increasingly limiting access to the people in need. At the same time, a few governments, for political reasons, have refused to allow humanitarian agencies in. Others have expelled them, especially NGOs, despite the adverse impact of such expulsions on the protection and assistance available to their citizens. And the responsibility to protect, R2P, is far from being a reality in many circumstances around the world. And finally, lines that used to clearly separate civilian and military spheres in the actions of the international community are increasingly also becoming blurred. In situations where peacekeepers are deployed to where there is no peace to keep, they risk becoming parties to the conflict. On the other hand, militaries are more and more often undertaking so-called humanitarian work in an effort to win hearts and minds of the population in conflict zones. And the resulting confusion is cynically and brutally explored by some belligerents to target humanitarian workers. And these actions undermine not only the operations in question, but the very foundations of humanitarian action. The changing nature of forced displacement is testing the international humanitarian system, and indeed the international community as a whole, in unprecedented ways. And meeting these challenges requires a number of commitments. I will speak about two of them today: more international solidarity and the recommitment to the fundamental tenets of protection to enable the international community to face the present and future realities of global displacement. Ladies and gentlemen, Australia, like most other developed countries, is fortunate to be far from the main sources of conflict and displacement I have mentioned here today. The overwhelming majority of the hundreds of thousands of new refugees uprooted by the many crises of 2011 found shelter and protection in countries neighboring their own. All of those countries kept their borders open, from Liberia and Ghana to Tunisia and Egypt, and from Turkey, Jordan and Lebanon to Kenya and Ethiopia, just to mention the key crises of 2011. On the whole, more than 80% of the world's refugees are hosted by developing countries. And many of them show a generosity that is well beyond their own means. They do not have the capacity to manage this pressure on their own, nor should they have to. Let me give you one example. Pakistan, the last country I visited before coming to Australia, is the world's largest refugee hosting country. It has sheltered millions of refugees for decades. After large voluntary return movements since 2002, some 1.7 million registered Afghan refugees still receive protection and assistance in Pakistan today, not counting many more Afghans who are in Pakistan undocumented. And this means 710 refugees to every US dollar of Pakistan's per capita GDP, a burden that is hard to imagine. The developed country that is highest on this list is Germany, in 25th place, with 710 versus 17 refugees per $1 US of its GDP per capita. Countries in the developed world can and must show more solidarity to help shoulder this burden. This should include broadening development cooperation to target refugee hosting and returnee areas so that solutions can become sustainable. More resettlement is another vital form of burden sharing, and ultimately such measures could be complemented with mobility through managed migration policies. In times like these, when international solidarity is more important than ever, I deeply appreciate the role that Australia plays in supporting development and humanitarian efforts in the Asia-Pacific region and worldwide. Your government's decision to increase its overseas development aid to 0.5% of GNI by 2015 and 16, with bipartisan support, is an important example of this commitment. Australia is a generous contributor to UNHCR's programs and emergency appeals, providing more than 50 million Australian dollars last year. The Australian government's contribution has nearly quadrupled since I first became High Commissioner. And in addition, during 2011, ordinary Australians gave $17 million from their own pockets towards UNHCR's relief efforts for refugees in other parts of the world. This funding allows us to provide life-saving humanitarian assistance to some of the most vulnerable people in the most dangerous and insecure regions of the world. And I'm also encouraged to see growing awareness in Australia of the need to support transitional programs in return areas and development actions targeting refugees and their host communities, particularly in protracted situations such as East Sudan or Nepal. Your government's financial support to a joint initiative of UNHCR and UNDP aimed at facilitating transitional solutions for long-standing refugees in several protracted situations would be an important signal of solidarity with countries which have hosted so many refugees for decades. And Australia also makes a crucial contribution to burden sharing by resettling large number of refugees from across the world. In the 65 years since the humanitarian resettlement program first started, more than 750,000 people have found a new home in this country. Australia's continued commitment to taking in thousands of refugees each year, often from some of the most protracted situations in Africa and Asia, is to be commended. And on a per capita basis, Australia is UNHCR's biggest resettlement country. However, I earlier noted the large gap globally between resettlement needs and places, and we of course would like all of our resettlement countries to do more if they have the means. In this context, I was pleased to be able to discuss with the Minister this week his aspiration, publicly expressed late last year, over time to increase the humanitarian program to 20,000 annual places should circumstances permit. And I very much hope this can be achieved. And beyond the mere numbers, one of the notable features of Australia's resettlement program is the excellent standard of settlement services provided to new arrivals, namely here in Sydney, something by which I was deeply impressed already during my first visit in 2009 and again this week. NGOs, community and faith-based groups, as well as central and local authorities, undertake essential and meaningful work toward helping new arrivals to integrate and settle into Australian society so that they can begin productive lives in this country. They provide housing, training, and education, giving refugees optimal opportunities to fully establish themselves and their families in Australia. Integration is the most challenging aspect of creating a truly durable solution, and Australian society achieves impressive results in this regard. At the same time, I have this week seen the wide range of civil society organizations passionately advocating for the legal rights of asylum seekers and also directly supporting those asylum seekers who are living in the community. And it is a great credit to this country that despite the heated political debate, when refugees and asylum seekers are actually living next door to Australians, it causes very little consternation at the community level. This is no doubt aided by strong community activities and networks that aim at facilitating and enhancing cross-cultural understanding and tolerance. Again, I commend Australia and its people for this achievement. I'm also very impressed by the work of the Refugee Council of Australia and the Settlement Council of Australia and all of those individual agencies and coalitions working to improve the lives of refugees and asylum seekers in this country. Also, not forgetting the key work volunteers contribute throughout this process. It is crucial that these efforts do not go unnoticed and be praised. Today's societies are all becoming multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious. And that is not only inevitable, but it is a good thing. Australians understood this very early on, and they have been very successful at building a tolerant and harmonious society. This country represents a reassuring example, more necessary than ever when we see the unfortunate developments of racism and xenophobia in so many parts of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, after solidarity, the second element of response to today's challenges of forced displacement is a reaffirmation of the fundamental principles of protection. And Australia also plays an important role in this regard, as demonstrated in its leadership as co-chair of a ministerial conference which UNHCR organized in December last year to commemorate the anniversaries of our Cornerstone Convention. With more than 800 registered participants from 155 countries, including 72 delegations at ministerial level, this was the largest meeting ever dedicated to the protection of refugees and stateless persons. And most states made concrete pledges to improve their protection, including Australia, which promised, among other things, to continue its generous funding for refugee programs worldwide, promote increased opportunities for refugee resettlement, and improve integration. And the meeting was a real breakthrough, in particular for statelessness, which had been a neglected issue on the global human rights agenda for decades. Over 30 states either acceded to one or both of the stateless conventions or announced they would do so in the near future. Given that the 61 Convention had only been ratified by 37 states during the first 49 years of existence, this was an enormous step forward. And the success of this meeting has shown that, indeed, there is a strong commitment to the basic tenets of protection across the international community. And I'm grateful to Minister Bowen and to the Australian Ambassador in Geneva, Peter Wolcott, who, together with their colleagues from Sweden and Egypt, ably helped to steer this complex intergovernmental process towards remarkable positive and concrete outcomes for improving refugee protection in the years ahead. Ladies and gentlemen, I am aware that the maritime movement of people in dangerous boat journeys is a problem that preoccupies many governments in this region, including your own. And I know that boat arrivals have been the subject of intense debate in Australia, including the possibility of offshore processing and a proposed transfer arrangement with Malaysia. Compared to the refugee problems in other regions of the world, it is my belief that this debate has been very politicized and is out of proportion in relation to the real dimensions of the issue, as the numbers of people coming to Australia are small by global standards. And this is why UNHCR has always been advocating for countries to grant access to their territory for people in need of protection, no matter how they arrive, and to ensure a fair treatment of their asylum claims. Yemen, one of the world's poorest countries and shaken by internal conflict and political turmoil for several years, received more than 100,000 asylum seekers and migrants in 2011 who crossed the Gulf of Aden from the Horn of Africa by boat. In keeping with Yemen's generous asylum policy, the Somalis among them were given prima facie refugee status upon arrival. The Mediterranean, where more than 57,000 people arrived by boat in Italy and Malta last year, has become the world's deadliest stretch of water for migrants and refugees, claiming an estimated 1,500 lives in 2011. I do believe that both arrivals can be discussed in a less polarized manner. Fundamental humanitarian and protection principles and human rights must always be placed at the heart of any response. But in this context, and having said that, 4 things should be recognized. Firstly, the importance of regional cooperation. And this holds true in this region as it does elsewhere in the world where states face similar challenges. Unilateral measures that divert or deflect asylum seekers away from borders do not address the deeper issues of human insecurity and protection. Unless managed carefully, they can also affect relations between states. In this regard, Australia's strengthened cooperation with its Asia-Pacific regional neighbours is key. The regional cooperation framework agreed by ministers through the Bali process in March last year now provides a broad framework to address the complex issues of irregular movement in the region, including the protection needs of asylum seekers and refugees. We need to build on these together. Genuine cooperation between Australian countries in Southeast Asia must be based on principles of burden sharing and responsibility sharing, and my office is committed to working with states to build strong national asylum procedures. From UNHCR's unique vantage point, any regional arrangements must contain explicit protection safeguards, both in the letter of the arrangements and in their implementation. These safeguards should include, most importantly, the right to asylum and respect for the principle of non-refoulement, humane reception conditions, including protection against prolonged and arbitrary detention, and access to basic rights such as education, healthcare, and employment. Special support for vulnerable people, particularly children, victims of torture and trauma, and others suffering from disabilities is also fundamental, as are concrete efforts to find durable solutions for refugees. Second, I fully acknowledge the dual challenge in an era of growing connectivity and human mobility, which all states must confront, of offering a hand of support and protection to those in need arriving at their borders, whilst at the same time ensuring their own security. States have the right, and indeed the obligation, to manage their borders responsibly. But this needs to be done in a way that is protection sensitive and does not preclude those who need protection from seeking it. Third, we must all be deeply concerned that so many innocent lives are lost at sea in tragedies like the ones of Christmas Island in December 2010, of Java at the end of last year, and most recently off the coast of Malaysia. And UNHCR strongly supports the efforts by the international community to crack down on traffickers and smugglers, which is key in protecting their victims. And fourth, let me assure you that my office always stands ready to discuss concrete solutions to these complex issues for the region. For UNHCR, the ultimate test of success is how far any arrangements are able to improve and expand the asylum space available to asylum seekers and refugees in the region, including here in Australia. If protection space can be increased across the region, the asylum seekers and refugees will be able to find greater levels of safety and security other than through dangerous and exploitative boat journeys. In this context, I have discussed my office's concerns about the impact of mandatory detention on the many asylum seekers and refugees affected by this long-standing policy in Australia. National security and health concerns might justify a limited period under which the movement of some asylum seekers need to be controlled. Nonetheless, the negative impact that prolonged mandatory detention has on people is well known and documented. There are alternatives to detention that can both satisfy legitimate security concerns and ensure that the health, welfare, and human rights of asylum seekers can be met in community settings. In this context, I welcome the measures taken by the Minister of Immigration since late 2010 to release children and some other vulnerable asylum seekers from detention. I was also briefed yesterday on recent steps to release more asylum seekers in the community on bridging visa arrangements. These are positive and welcome changes that underscore Australia's fundamental commitment to uphold the principle of refugee protection, including under challenging circumstances. After my yesterday contacts in Canberra, I'm looking forward to substantial progress in this area. Ladies and gentlemen, the Refugee Convention is a contemporary and living instrument that lies at the heart of protection for millions of refugees around the world today. Over 6 decades, it has shown remarkable adaptability and relevance to the now 148 states that have signed it. And I'm convinced that the Convention will continue to have the same vitality and relevance in the future as it had for its founding members. With its global perspective, UNHCR is urging states and non-state actors around the world to look at the broader picture of forced displacement and protection to avoid simplistic or populist explanations for what are very complex and multidimensional issues. Fears about projected floods of refugees in industrialized countries are often vastly overblown or mistakenly conflated with issues of migration, and those fears can all too easily manifest into statements and acts of xenophobia against foreigners, be they refugees, migrants, or others. With that in mind, I encourage all of those involved in public discourse in this country to approach the issue of refugees and asylum seekers with a sense of balance, perspective, and compassion for those who are less fortunate. And as with any other social issue of our times, there is always a need for strong moral leadership and community support for the basic values that underpin the system of asylum and refugee protection. From what I have seen and heard during my visit to your wonderful country, I'm encouraged by how so many people have shown their commitment to welcome and protect those less fortunate displaced by persecution and war. Thank you very much.
Mr. Prime Minister, is that the way I
Antonio,
address
is fine.
Antonio, thank you.
Prime Ministers are many. Antonio, it's
yes. Thank you very much for your speech. You know, one of the issues that puzzles me is how one looks at the difference between a refugee and an economic migrant. And I think a lot of the debate in this country is clouded by that. And I just wondered if you'd got any assistance that would help us actually better understand that and come to terms with that. I think we could start calling people smugglers travel agents, because that's essentially what they often are. And the other issue on a more personal level, I just wondered, given your involvement with East Timor and those negotiations all that time ago, how you think East Timor is going?
Well, first of all, the traditional distinction is quite easy. I mean, a refugee is someone that crosses a border fleeing a conflict or persecution. Persecution of different sorts. It can be political persecution, it can be religious persecution, it can be persecution related to belonging to a special social group. For instance, gay people are dramatically persecuted in some countries, it is well known. A migrant, an economic migrant, is someone that decides voluntarily to move from one country to another in search of a better life, which is something I fully appreciate. And I mean, my country has been a country of emigration for centuries, and Australia has been a country of immigration for also a few centuries. So if there is an area that Australia is very familiar to is migration. The problem is that in today's world we are seeing more and more situations where this distinction becomes blurred. First of all, because we have concrete countries. Somalia in the recent year was an example of that, in which you had people fleeing because Shabab was targeting them, and you had people fleeing because of hunger. And it's very difficult to make this distinction. And it's clear that those that were fleeing because of hunger are not refugees in the sense that the 51 Convention doesn't cover hunger, but they are not also typical economic migrants moving voluntarily, because they were forced to flee because there was nothing to eat in their regions. And so this is sometimes creating difficulties in the modern debate, I would say the present debate on asylum and migration. And we are discussing exactly this asylum-migration nexus. But I think it's very important to keep the principles clear. Those that are in need of protection should in all circumstances be granted access to territories where protection can be granted and should have a fair treatment of their claims. Not all asylum seekers are refugees. You can even have people that abuse the system and tries to go through the system to be granted protection that that person doesn't deserve. But that is why states have refugee status mechanisms, refugee status discrimination mechanisms that in some situations are very effective, in others not so. And UNHCR is playing its role as a monitoring entity to make sure that there is quality in the decisions that are taking about the asylum claims made by people. And our key objective is to guarantee that those that are in need of protection can have access to territories where they can enjoy their protection and a fair treatment of their claims. The problem is that in today's world, we have an asymmetric globalization. Money moves freely, and so freely that we don't even know where it is at a certain moment. Goods tend to move more and more freely, and free trade is, I would say, a priority in most of the policies expressed in today's world. But there are huge obstacles to the movement of people. But there is growingly a global labor market. And when there is a global labor market, supply will tend to meet demand. And when supply meets demand, it does so legally if possible, irregularly if necessary. And as in the past, when there were closed borders for goods, there were smugglers. Now, obviously, smuggling became a very profitable activity because many people cannot move. And at the same time, in some parts of the world, there is an effective need of migration. I mean, my country has today a fertility rate of 1.3, which means that Portugal cannot survive without migration. And this is not recognized everywhere. So when this is not recognized, in my country, fortunately, this was recognized some time ago, but when this is not recognized and borders are closed, I mean, people are needed, so smuggling becomes a very profitable organ. And the drama is that as smuggling has been increasing, it has been more and more linked to a much more hideous activity, which is the trafficking of human beings, which means a real slavery development in which people are trafficked for forms of sexual exploitation and other similar ones. And the smuggling networks became more and more linked to criminal organizations and themselves doing dramatic violations of human rights. And so this is becoming a nasty business. And that is why it is so important, in my opinion, to work effectively in order to crack down on smugglers and traffickers, but at the same time on protecting their victims. Because unfortunately, we have today refugees and asylum seekers in the world that have no other way to find protection but through smuggling networks, because they cannot move legally and freely, escaping their situations and moving into spaces where they can find that protection. So it's a very complex situation. I think we need to be very pragmatic in addressing it. And as I said, very important to crack down on smugglers and traffickers, very important to keep in our mind the need to protect their victims.
Thank you very much for your address. Many countries in this region aren't parties to the convention. Is there any hope that more might accede, or is regional cooperation the only likely positive response to the regional issue? And finally, sir, have you thought about a career in politics in Australia?
First of all, I would like to say I cannot express a political opinion on East Timor because in my present mandate I cannot express political opinions. That is why I also will not be able to answer the second part of your question. But I can only hope, and I mean, I feel a lot of emotions about East Timor, as you can imagine. And I'm very grateful for the role Australia played in order to guarantee that in East Timor the worst could be avoided in a dramatic moment. And I was very active in dialogue with the Australian government at that moment. But I can only hope that East Timor moves forward and is successful for the Timorese people. Going back to the convention situation, I think it's indeed a real problem that Australia faces. If one looks at some of the key refugee crises in the world, Afghanistan, for instance, and if one goes from Afghanistan into Australia, there is no country on the way that has signed and ratified the convention. Some countries have a welcoming attitude towards refugees. India, for example, they haven't signed the convention, they haven't ratified the convention, but if you look at the Tibetan refugees in India, it is obvious that there is a tradition of protection and welcoming of refugees, but others not. And in any way, the ratification of the convention is an important instrument, an important tool to build protection regimes. That doesn't mean that all countries that ratify the convention are protection sensitive, and that all countries that do not ratify the convention are not protection sensitive. But it's an important tool, and we strongly hope that confidence building in the context of the regional cooperation framework that was approved in the Bali process will slowly make countries move to the understanding that they cannot be considered only as countries of transit, even because they are becoming more developed countries. Countries like Malaysia or Thailand have migration needs. They need more migrant workers, and so there is no reason in that context also to have a negative attitude towards asylum. So I think it's important that these countries, as they also develop their economies and their societies, understand that it is not only not problematic, but it is positive for them to define their own protection regimes. And we'll be working as much as we can to promote it. What I believe is that the attitude that can be effective in Australians' policy in relation to these countries to make them go the extra mile for that purpose is to show an effective commitment of burden sharing and partnership, and not just an idea that you should do it and putting pressure on them. I think they need to feel that this partnership is a real factor. And I'm hopeful that, as in many other parts of the world, these regimes will be developed. Today, the most effective, I would say, not necessarily effective, because in practical terms sometimes they have difficulties in working, but the most advanced legal regimes in the world for refugee protection are in Latin America. They are not in the developed world. The African Convention is better than the 51 Convention in relation to refugee protection. And so, indeed, the idea that refugee protection is essentially available in the developed world is no longer a reality. And I think it's very important to do everything we can in order to make sure that these countries that are becoming key players in the international community develop their own protection regimes.
And my thanks for your speech today also. In the absence of a regional solution, is there any form of offshore processing which is acceptable or which is less evil? And also our political leaders are very keen on the deterrent and finding a deterrent. Is there any advice you can give them on some form of deterrent? Or is it a wrong way of thinking?
Well, first of all, as I said, our preference, and this has been UNHCR position since always, is that each country does its own processing. And that, again, the debate, in my opinion, in Australia is inflated. The number of boat arrivals last year was about 6,000. I mean, Yemen received 100,000. The number of asylum requests in South Africa last year, South Africa is not by boat arrivals, it's by walking into South Africa, was 180,000 individual asylum requests. So, I mean, it's very difficult for me as High Commissioner that have to deal with the whole world to be convinced that 6,000 is a very important problem. I understand that in the psychology of Australia, the collective psychology of Australia, this is an important problem, and I respect that. But you need to understand also, the global perspective. Having said so, our position has been the following. If mechanisms for decision are taking in the context of this regional cooperation mechanism, they need to guarantee those protection requirements that I mentioned, not only in its establishment, but in its implementation. And obviously, this is something that is fundamental, because if not, the protection is really not granted. But our preference would be, as I said, that this question would not be as lively as it is in this country. But of course, I mean, we have to live with the reality, and we recognize that fact, and we respect that fact, and we respect the right of the Australian people to decide, according to the Australian political system, what are the policies that Australia wants to develop. UNHCR will always be clearly advocating for very strong guarantees that the protection safeguards that I mentioned are fully respected.
High Commissioner, I guess following on from that a bit, clearly in Australia, you're nice about it, but I don't think Australia is doing that good a job in terms of what we could be doing compared to some other international countries. And one of the reasons for that is because the debate is so politicised in Australia. Do you have any advice you'd be allowed to give, or any precedents elsewhere of a developed country that has been in a position where it's been a politicised issue but has managed to I guess, step away from that and have more of a bilateral approach?
Well, one thing I learned in my life is that foreigners are the worst possible persons to give advice on how countries should manage their own political lives. So I will not dare do so. One of the things I also try as UN High Commissioner is to say we cannot reduce the relationship between Australia and UNHCR to one issue. And it's not even the most important issue. I mean, as I said, Australia has received in resettlement until now 750,000 people. I mean, this is a very important contribution to refugee protection worldwide. And this should also be acknowledged. So as I said, we cannot reduce our relationship to the discussion of the both people. That, I think, we would be doing exactly the same kind of inflation that we consider probably is not relevant in the context of the debate that takes place. So this is an important question. We are willing to participate in the discussion and to give our cooperation to find adequate solutions, but it's important to recognize that there are other aspects in which the international community should recognize Australia's role. Your support to humanitarian aid, your very important resettlement program, the biggest per capita in the world, and your extremely successful reintegration policy in relation to those refugees in Australia. And last visit, I was extremely impressed by the Melbourne program and the way in Melbourne people would integrate in the society in a very successful way. And also the clear positive attitude towards multiculturalism. And coming from my part of the world, this is something that needs to be also underlined. There are still countries in which people have not understood that societies will all become, as I said, multicultural, multi-religious, and multi-ethnic. There are still countries that still aspire to some kind of identity that is no longer possible in the modern world. And the multiculturalism, the authenticity of the multiculturalism in Australia is again another very important contribution that Australia is giving to debate. So I think it's important for us also to put things into perspective. This question is not the only question that is relevant in the debate about Australia's refugee policy, but of course it is a question that needs to be considered, and in relation to which I would prefer the debate to be much calmer and much less polarized, as I witness it is in Australia. But I'm not going to give any advice on how to avoid it, because that advice would probably not contribute to anything positive. Lady down.
You've emphasised the importance of regional agreements, but you've said that any kind of transfer agreement or regional agreement between Australia and another country has to have safeguards that are not just implemented but written into those agreements. Your office had spent a lot of time looking at the Malaysia transfer agreement. The High Court had broadly dismissed, I guess, the intent of that agreement and focused on the letter of it, and said that there wasn't enough written into that agreement that would protect refugees. Was that the view of the UNHCR?
Well, the Malaysia Agreement is not being enforced at the present moment. At the time, we are not party to the agreement. The agreement was made between two states and not ratified by Australia. At the time of the agreement, we have expressed a certain number of concerns that we consider essential in order for that agreement to be something we could work with. It's not what we like, but it's something that we could work with, a certain number of concerns. The letter of the agreement has reflected, I would say, the essential part of these concerns. But it's not only a question of letter, it's a question of implementation, as you said. So, this is not a question that is now on the table. Independently of what the future will be, we'll always be ready to discuss with governments, even if there are solutions that are not our preferred solutions, to be able to contribute to guarantee that whatever solution is one day implemented is a solution that fully respects the rights of people as I have described. It's not only a question of how to draft a paper, it's a question of to make sure that it's effectively implemented.
Thank you. Anthony Zui, University of New South Wales. Thanks very much for impressive presentation. I was actually at a talk earlier this morning, and it strikes me that you've both said something similar. It was by the president of the International Criminal Court, and he made the remark that if the instruments that had produced the International Criminal Court were to be rewritten today, they would not be able to produce as effective or independent a body despite its limitations, and you've said something similar. So my question is, in relation to current intergovernmental challenges in addressing major complex problems and the difficulties that governments find in reaching agreement on these intractable issues, what do you feel is the role of national and international civil society in advancing those issues?
Well, my sincere opinion is that we have witnessed in the recent past that the national sovereignty agenda has gained ground in relation to the human rights agenda in the international community. And the fact that to a certain extent we are in this transition between a unipolar to a multipolar world, and sometimes we get the impression that nobody's in charge, that things happen in an unpredictable way. Who can now predict what's the next crisis? I mean, we already had two in 2012 between Sudan, South Sudan, and now the Tuaregs in Mali. I mean, where will be the next one? I have no idea. But in this context, it is also easier to have impunity and to use national sovereignty as an argument against the exercise of the so-called responsibility to protect. And that is where we are at the present moment, in my opinion, which means that it will be very difficult to reach a meaningful global consensus on the promotion, legally binding promotion of human rights instruments. And this is true for the 51 Convention. It probably would be true for the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and it might be true, I have not read this comment, but it might be true about the statutes of the International Criminal Court. I feel that indeed the national sovereignty agendas have been gaining ground in relation to the human rights agenda in the international community. And this is a very worrying trend. It's a very worrying trend.
Malfunctioning leadership seems to be one of the major causes of displacement for refugees and other problems. And just in the same way that globalization has addressed economic issues, is there a move afoot to actually address this kind of the problems with leadership, tyranny, and so on, that is happening? Is there any possibility or any hope that that will happen one day?
I think that one of the central questions in today's world is the question of governance. It has several dimensions: the leadership dimension, the corruption dimension, and indeed, I believe that in many situations in the world, bad governance has been one of the root causes of the situations that generate displacement. And again, unfortunately, this is something that it's not easy to overcome. I mean, the questions of the promotion of good governance in today's world are, in my opinion, central questions, not only for prevention of refugee crisis, but for many other aspects, namely related to development, to social justice, to the reduction of poverty, and many other key objectives for the international community.
Last question. Thanks very much. Stephen Pringle from the Australian Civil Military Centre. Excellency, you mentioned
no excellencies, please.
Okay. You mentioned a number of times, Antonio, the blurring of the lines between civilian, military and police actors. How do you see that developing over the coming years in terms of protection of civilians, of all of the actors working together to get the best possible outcome?
I'll give you an example of the UN in relation to these debates. In the UN presence in many countries, you have today integrated missions, and you have different components of the presence of the UN. You have a military mission, you have police, CIVPOL presence, you have the civilian part of the mission, and you have the different UN agencies. Now, in many circumstances, the structural integration of these different components has no problem. But in a certain number of situations, Somalia was the good example, you have the political and security dimension of the UN involved in a conflict. In the case of Somalia, UN supports AMISOM, the force of the African Union. In other cases, it's a peacekeeping force of the UN in itself. And in many circumstances, the mandate of those forces is not compatible with the principles of humanitarian action, that are principles of neutrality, impartiality, and independence. So in those situations, I would advocate for missions not to be integrated, or if they are integrated at strategic level, not to be integrated at structural level, to preserve the autonomy of the humanitarian space. Because humanitarian actors need to act in all areas, government-controlled and rebel-controlled areas. And when peacekeeping operations take place in zones where there is no peace to keep and peacekeepers become party to the conflict, you need to be able to address the needs of people in the areas where the forces operate or in the areas where they cannot penetrate. So I think it's very important to preserve these values of autonomy of the humanitarian space when, and it's a very clear limitation, when the security and political dimension of the UN intervention is by nature, and by the nature of the decisions that were taken at political level, linked to one party of the conflict. But these are a limited number of situations in which this precaution needs to be taken.
Ladies and gentlemen, please.